welcome to another History with Professor Hevert video. What we're going to do today is we are going to talk about the lifeblood of the discipline of history. And you can already tell by the title what we're going to be doing, but we need to really look deeply at how one reads a primary source. So this is going to be a bit of an introduction to the topic. If you are a seasoned historian who has already got some experience with reading primary sources, this will be the how to read primary sources 101 sort of thing. So here's the plan of attack. What I'm going to do is I am going to walk through the basic steps of how one approaches, reads, and analyzes a primary source. We're going to talk about it generally. Then we're going to look at a primary source, sort of, and then we'll talk about how we can use that as evidence in a history essay. And I'll use one from my own classes as an example. So, before we get to that, here's the primary source, or one of the primary sources that we're going to look at for this video. And we have to take stock of a few things before we even get into the source itself. One thing that is key for doing any academic reading for whatever class that you have is you need to read with a purpose. Reading can't be passive. You can't just decode the words on the page and stare at it, and then when you finally get to the end, say that you're done. Reading for research, reading for any sort of academic enterprise requires you to do more work. And part of that work is, well, let's break it down into three categories, okay? So we have pre-reading, the reading itself, and post-reading. And in many ways, pre-reading and post-reading, when we're reading for an academic exercise, is as important as just the reading itself. So, the first thing, before we jump in to the source itself, is let me suggest to you that the introduction to a source is as important as any other thing in the source. And what does an introduction to the source look like? What kind of information can you get from it? Let me explain. So let's go to our primary source again. Here it is. And typically when you get something from the American Yop, if you're in US history, or you've got a primary source reader, something that your professor's given to you, the introduction's always at the top. So this is the introduction for this particular source, okay? Usually in italics right there, right at the top. Let's look at another one just to give you another example. Here's another primary source. Here's the introduction here. Reading the introduction is going to give you a couple of important pieces of information, depending on what the author has decided, or the editor of the primary source has decided to add. In this one, this is going to give us some background. It's going to tell us precisely what the primary source has as its intention. Okay? Laura Kellogg, the author of the primary source, has this as her intention. Now, if we look at the Chester A. Arthur, we don't have nearly as much information, right? So all we get is the following is extracted from President Chester A. Arthur's first annual message to Congress delivered on that date. All right, so there's a couple things that we can pull out from this right away. So we can set ourselves up for understanding this primary source. And the questions that we're going to ask, if we go back to our 5 C's, you guys remember the 5 C's from the other day? I know, it's like, oh man, what's he talking about? Here they are again. And when we're doing the pre-reading for a primary source, what we're really looking for is context. We need to know the basics of the primary source. We need to know about the author. We need to know about the time period. We need to know about the intended audience, all that sort of stuff. So one of the things that you should do immediately is get yourselves ready for these 5 contextual questions. Who, what, where, when, and why. These probably look really familiar to you, right? Or you're like, wait a second, I learned this in 2nd grade. But they're critical. Okay? There's a reason why we teach children so early to ask these sorts of questions, because they're the foundational questions for learning all sorts of things. When applied to a primary source in history, we need to know who wrote it. What did they write? Okay, like what particular thing is it? Is it a genre that we need to look at? Like what kind of species of source, so to speak, is the primary source? Where was this done? When was it written? Why was it written? Or why was it produced? Because primary sources aren't just written documents. There are all sorts of things, from movies to television shows to speeches to music to interviews with people. A primary source can be just about anything. So why was this thing produced? Though we want to hang on to that why question for another reason, and we're going to analyze that in the post-reading, because why is the question that leads to analysis, and that's all about the post-reading. So if we go to our primary source again, here it is. What information can we get out of this very brief introduction? Well, again, we're thinking about who, what, where, when, why. We could say, what's its purpose? And we're just asking this of the document itself. We're not trying to figure out, how this tells us about the alignment of the stars or anything like that yet. Okay, we'll get there. Well, we're not going to talk about how this works into astrology. Sorry. It's just not what I do. But we want to ask, what's its purpose? So all we get is the following is extracted from President Chester A. Arthur's first annual message to Congress delivered on that date. Well, we know, for example, we know when. It gives us a precise date. So we're talking about the end of the 19th century. Who? We have President Chester A. Arthur. Now, this is from a United States history class. So if we are doing United States history and we see the word president right next to the word Congress, we know that this guy is the president of the United States. Or you may know who Chester A. Arthur is just because you know who Chester A. Arthur is. You're like, okay, he's a president. Now, so we know who, we know when, where. Well, he's giving a speech. Okay, we know that from this thing called First Annual Message. More on that in a second. He is addressing Congress, the United States Congress. So we know what he's up to. He's giving a speech to Congress, and that kind of takes care of the where. And what's its purpose? He is going to explain American Indian policy. We know that from the title because that's what our editors have given us. All right. Now, one thing to note, maybe you've heard of a State of the Union address. They used to be called the annual message. So the first annual message was the first time that Chester A. Arthur gave a State of the Union address to Congress. And the thing that he is going to talk about here is what the United States policy towards Native Americans should be. And that should already give you some clues as to what we're going to find. We're going to, hey, if we're talking about the US government and Native Americans, we're going to see some assumptions about Native Americans, who they are, what they do, a lot of backwards racist sort of thinking. I hate to say it, but it's true. We're going to see that sort of stuff, and we're going to see the President of the United States, Chester Arthur, present some ideas about what the United States should do. So that's our pre-reading. We've got our context. We know that we know quite a bit about what this primary source is just from reading that first sentence. Let's take one more step, though, before we get into the reading itself. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to switch back to my desktop, and I'm going to take a look at, not Blackboard, but we're going to take a look at the American Yawp, the textbook that I use for my course. All right. So where this primary source came from was from the American Yawp. If we look at primary sources, there it is right there. So right away, we know by looking at the textbook or the main book that your professor is reading or having you read, we kind of have an idea of what's going on here. So this is a chapter about the West. So we're going to learn about this Indian policy, this Native American policy, in the context of a discussion of the American West. And so we want to take a look and see, especially in this case, are there any sorts of titles here, these subtitles, that might be good pre-reading before we do the primary source itself. And we've got a few things. We've got Indian wars and federal peace policies. We have the allotment era and resistance in the Native West, at the very least. All right, so we can just skim through this and we can learn quite a bit. Okay, this goes up until about 1864. All right, so this is in 1881. So this is some good background information to know about the primary source. Okay, then if we go a little bit further, we see that we're starting to move forward in time. There's more conflict here. We're getting into the mid 1870s. And then finally, we see 1881 down here, where we're seeing Sitting Bull laying down their weapons, etc. Now, there's a little bit of Native history in here, Beyond the Plains section. Definitely take a look at that. We can probably skip over Western economic expansion, at least reminding ourselves of that. But if we look here, we start to see a little bit more about Congress enacting policy towards natives. All right. So take a look at this paragraph right here. By the 1880s, Americans increasingly championed legislation to allow the transfer of indigenous lands, that's native lands, to farmers and ranchers, taking Native American land away from the Native Americans and giving them to American farmers and ranchers. Many argued that allotting land to individual Native Americans rather than to tribes would encourage American-style agriculture and finally put Indians who had previously resisted the efforts of missionaries and federal officials on the path to civilization. Okay? The idea here, the efforts of missionaries and federal officials getting Native Americans on the path to civilization, means that these policies that we're going to see, as well as the efforts of missionaries and federal officials, that means that the United States government wanted to make the Native American, despite their tribe, despite their culture, despite their heritage, into what they believe, okay, what the United States government believes is an ideal American. We want to teach them things like capitalism. We want to teach them about things like private property, things like Christianity, all of that sort of stuff. And then the idea is once they become good Americans, then there won't be any fighting anymore. So we know that that is going on at the time. All right. And that helps us get into the mindset of the primary source that we're about to read. So not only do we have the background for the author and the purpose of the piece, the source, I should say, but we also have an idea of the historical context itself. Now, once we have all that in mind, and it's not a bad thing to take some notes on this. You know, you could look and say, I need to make sure that I read chapter, this is 17, part 6. Okay, and you can make a note about the Dawes Allotment Act. I can't spell, I'm sorry. It's 2 L's. All right. So you have all of that in mind. Now you're actually ready to read the source. And to save us all time and embarrassment, because me reading aloud, maybe I do have a voice for radio, and I want to say I have a face for YouTube, but I probably have a face for radio. I don't know where I was going with that. In any case, I to save us embarrassment, we're going to fast forward just a little bit. So here's our source. We have our pre-reading notations on this. And now we're going to read it. And so here we go. All of a sudden, magic, bingo, presto. Boom. I've read it now. I've got some notes. All right. So what you see on the paper here is you see my way of taking notes on the source. Everybody has their own way of taking notes. Sometimes people do what I do, or something similar to what I do. Sometimes people write their notes in a notebook instead. What you need to do is you need to use whatever method that you feel most comfortable with. If you are trying to take notes in a way that seems unnatural to you, you're going to spend most of your mental energy thinking about how you're taking notes and not enough mental energy actually engaging with the text. So let me show you how I have interacted with the reading here, and just give you some ideas. So one of the things that I did, and I don't usually do this, but for the sake of the exercise, I think it's useful, in the margins, and the margins are always a great place to take notes because then it's right on the source. What I've done is I've written a basic sentence that summarizes what these various paragraphs say. That's one way that I interact with the text. And just to show you my good habit, You can see it on all of the whole primary source here. Another thing that I like to do is I like to underline things that are important. So for example, later on in the source, President Arthur starts making a list. All right. So here he says, here are my suggestions. He's going to end up having 3, and he starts listing them. So one of the things that I've made sure to do is underline exactly what he's proposing in the source. All right. So you can see 2nd up there, 3rd down here. Another thing that's good to do, especially if you're having trouble with the language of a primary source, is to circle or box the words that you're not sure about and write a little bit of a definition right above it, or maybe in the margins, whatever works best for you. So here's makeshift, and so it's kind of like something that's jury rigged or done by the seat of the pants. It's just like, well, I don't know what to do, but I got all these parts in front of me, so I'm gonna build something out of these parts, and now I have this thing. Or illimitable, or if there's a concept that I need to remind myself about, like down here where he mentions the quote unquote 5 civilized tribes, I remind myself, okay, these are the tribes that he's talking about. Other things that I do, if I need to divide like a bigger paragraph into parts because it's talking about 2 different things, I tend to draw a line on the side and be like, okay, this is one thing, this is another thing that I've got to do, or I've got to think about. And that's just that visual cue to me that there's 2 ideas here. Why do all of this extra stuff? Because it's going to mean it takes longer to read, right? And for some of us, that's really, it's almost a deal breaker. Like, well, if it's going to take me like 20 minutes to read 3 pages, what's the point? I'm supposed to go fast. I'll never be done with my homework if I am taking 20 minutes to read 3 pages. Well, if you're going to end up using this as evidence to do another assignment, if you have these notes right here, yes, you've invested 20 minutes at the forefront, but the next time you go and look at the source, like when you're writing your essay, you'll have those notes to yourself, and you can scan your notes with your eyes rather than the whole source, and you'll know exactly what's going on. Same with the context, and also importantly, what you take away from it. So just to summarize this source really quickly, because I'm going to assume that you haven't read it. You could read it for yourself if you go to the American Yawp website and click on the link to it. But essentially what Chester A. Arthur is saying is this, is he says, what we're doing with the Native Americans in the past, it hasn't worked out very well. We're starting to do something different, and we're starting to see some success. To support that success, we're going to do 3 things. Number 1 is the government, the Congress is going to make sure that all of the laws of states and territories apply to the Indian reservations contained within that state, and that Native Americans should receive the protection of the law. Kind of reminded me of the 14th Amendment. Okay, so we're going to make the laws apply to Native Americans, and we're going to make sure that they get the protection of those laws, which is something that the Native Americans have been asking for a long time. The second thing that they're going to do is they are going to, or his suggestion is to enact a general law, okay, just a whole federal law that says, okay, for 20 to 25 years, you Native Americans get this plot of land. Okay, there's no more reservation, but this is land that is yours, guaranteed for 20 to 25 years. And he thinks that what this is going to do is this is going to make them move away from the quote unquote old ways and adopt the new late 19th century version of agriculture. And that'll help them join society better. And then lastly, he's saying, all right, we're going to make some Indian schools. These aren't going to be on the reservation per se, but these are going to be schools where Native Americans go and learn how to be civilized, meaning they're going to learn how to be white Americans or act like white Americans, essentially. If you've watched the news or paid attention to the news lately, we know how inhumane these Indian schools used to be, to say the very least. And we can talk about that another time. So that's the general plan. Now that we have an understanding of the source, we can do our post reading and we can make ourselves some notes about our reaction to this. So immediately when I got done with the source, what I did is I was like, wait a second, this reminds me of all of the other times that either the American colonial governments or the United States government has tried to do almost these exact same things and failed. Completely failed. At least in their minds, right? There's always been Native American resistance to this sort of thing. I also down here, I was like, well, who has the agency here? Who's really directing how this goes? Do Native Americans really have a say in their lives if these laws are to go through? I know my answer, but it's something to consider. And another question I wrote down just really quick, why should the Native Americans trust the U.S. government? Because the U.S. government has promised them land and autonomy and all sorts of other things before, and they've reneged on those promises one after another. So this is all stuff that we can think about in our post reading. So if your professor is asking you to react to a primary source, these are the sort of things that you can use as a way of organizing your reaction. Now, lastly, now that we've done our pre-reading, our reading, and our post-reading, let's go ahead and let's look at an essay assignment really quick. All right, so this is for my classes. I assign these essays, and I'm not worried about them being on YouTube because they're fine. Now, if we're looking at these three options, and we're thinking, okay, what source would this go with? Option 2 is probably the best, since it's talking about the American West. This is asking about industry and labor. This is asking about imperialism. This could fit. Certainly, our sources could fit, but this question's asking about the early 20th century, and this source is from 1881, so the end of the 19th century. Now, if we look at the question, okay, what is the significance of the American West? When arriving at the essay's conclusion, the essay should examine a variety of groups who had a vested interest in the American West: businessmen, settlers, workers, immigrants, the federal government, Native Americans, and entertainers. Don't have to include all those groups, etc., blah, blah, blah. So what we have here in this primary source is we clearly have evidence of groups that have a vested interest in the West. Because this is the federal government of the United States, we now have some evidence of how the federal government sees the American West. And one of the things that's very clear here is that the conflicts with Native Americans need to end so that continuing settlement can happen. All right. And we have evidence for how the president of the United States is approaching this from a legislative point of view. What this doesn't have is it doesn't have the perspective of Native Americans, right? Because we're only talking about the president of the United States and Congress. If we wanted, where's my button? If we wanted a perspective for Native Americans, we could look at something like this primary source, which comes a little bit later, but it deals with the Indian education that Arthur was talking about. And we know that, based on our introduction, that Laura Cornelius Kellogg is a Native American. She's identified as a member of the Oneida. And she's trying to take the reins of her own and her people's own destinies. So I was searching for words. All right. So this can give us this perspective of the American government, and it's very clear, according to Arthur, what they want to do. Okay, they want the resistance to stop, and here's 3 plans for how that's going to go. Hey, we're going to civilize Native Americans, quote unquote civilized. And the significance of that is the United States government clearly understands for itself that the West is crucial for American development. And you could cross-reference that with a couple other sources too. So all in all, that is a basic general overview of how to read a primary source. I will say in closing that this is a skill that needs practice and development. It's not something you do right the first time. It's not something that you do right the second time. It takes practice, 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 practice. And even the most seasoned veteran historians who teach in places like Princeton or Harvard or UC Berkeley, the big top schools, they still need practice too. And if they don't continually renew their skills, get rusty, and you don't do as good a job figuring out what sorts of evidence you can pull from these sources. So don't feel bad if you're struggling. All right. I'll wrap this up now because we're already at 33 and a half minutes, and I was like, this will be a 12-minute video. Guess not. So keep practicing reading primary sources. They're the best parts of history, to say the very, very least, and that's going to help you in your history classes, especially when it comes to writing essays. This is a skill that is great to take away. So be good to yourselves, stay healthy, stay safe, and I will see you in the next one. Take care, friends.